Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. This time, we're taking a look at something, well, it might sound a little contradictory at first, Humanist Wicca. Our source material for this deep dive is really interesting. It's a first-person account.
Ooh.
And so you have Wicca, right, often associated with deities and magic. And then you have humanism with its emphasis on logic and reason and the scientific method. So how can these two seemingly different ideas work together?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? It's like mixing oil and water. But our source, Bryan Stafford, seems to have found a way to make it work.
Bryan Stafford and his group, the Sacred Meadow Circle. But before we get into that, can we talk about what Humanist Wicca actually means, according to Bryan?
Well, Bryan defines it as a deep reverence for nature and the interconnectedness of all people seen through a scientific lens. And it's about ethical living as well. So finding meaning and purpose without relying on supernatural things.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how this might work. But there's still some tension, right? Because Wicca usually involves deities, but Bryan's an atheist. So how does that work?
That's what I found so interesting, actually. He doesn't see deities as, like, real beings, but rather as symbols of different parts of human nature.
So instead of, like, praying to a goddess for a good harvest, you might focus on being patient and nurturing yourself.
Yeah, exactly. It's about recognizing those energies within us and working with them consciously and deliberately. And that's where Carl Jung's work is so relevant.
Wait, Carl Jung, the psychologist, tell me more about that.
Jung was fascinated by this subconscious mind and those archetypes, universal patterns that show up everywhere. And Bryan uses Jungian psychology to understand those archetypes in Wiccan practices.
So he's saying that what some might call supernatural is actually the subconscious mind.
Precisely. And by understanding the psychology behind it, we can see these things differently.
That changes everything. You know, I've always liked the rituals in Wicca, but the deities never really, clicked for me. This feels like a way to connect without all that.
That seems to be what Bryan experienced too. He talked about feeling like an outsider in traditional Wiccan groups because of his atheism. It took him 8 years to find his path.
Wow, 8 years. That's a long time. What kind of challenges did he face, and how did he end up with this unique approach?
I'm sure we'll learn more about that as we go deeper into this deep dive. But it definitely shows how important it is to find people who get you, especially when your beliefs are different. Which brings us to the Sacred Meadow Circle.
Tell me about this group. What do they actually do?
Think of it as a space for discussion and exploration. Bryan leads activities and discussions that let members look at Wiccan ideas from a humanist perspective.
So they might explore the symbols of a ritual, but without believing in magic.
Exactly. It's about looking past tradition and dogma to see those core truths. And that's what I find so compelling about Bryan's approach. It's not about rejecting tradition, but making it relevant for today.
This is so interesting. I'm already seeing how this could be really enriching, even for someone who isn't Wiccan.
Absolutely. It makes us think about what we believe, to see how different ideas connect, and to find meaning in a world that feels kind of broken sometimes.
And it shows the power of community in creating a space for understanding. But how does this all work in real life? How does Bryan actually live these humanist Wiccan principles?
That's where things get really interesting, and that's what we'll get into in part 2. But before we take a break, what stands out to you about Humanist Wicca so far?
Honestly, it's the idea that you can have a spiritual path that feels true to you without having to follow all the rules, and how Bryan uses psychology to look at Wiccan practices. It's amazing. It makes me want to totally rethink my own approach to spirituality. Before we started this deep dive, I kind of thought Humanist Wicca was like a really solitary thing, but it seems like community is actually super important.
Yeah, for sure. Bryan's story shows how important it is to find your people, especially when you're doing something different. The Sacred Meadow Circle gives that sense of belonging.
So what kind of things do they do in the Sacred Meadow Circle? Like, do they actually do rituals or like book clubs?
They do a lot of different things, actually. From what I read, they have discussions about ethical stuff and personal growth. They explore nature symbolism, and they do mindfulness exercises. Bryan even does ceremonies, like naming ceremonies and hand fastings, but with that humanist perspective.
So it's not just about thinking about Wiccan ideas, but about actually using them in your life.
Exactly. Bryan emphasizes living it, not just talking about it. He said something like, "I've always believed that everyone deserves dignity and respect, no matter who they are or what they believe." That really shows his humanist values.
That's so true. It reminds me of how humanism is about our shared humanity. How does that play out in his actions?
Well, for Bryan, it means ethical living, social justice, and taking care of the environment. He sees those values as a key part of Humanist Wicca. It's about aligning your actions with your beliefs and trying to make a positive impact on the world.
That makes sense. It's not just about personal growth, but about responsibility to the community and the planet, too. Which makes me think Bryan seems pretty optimistic about the future of Humanist Wicca. Why is that?
I think it's a couple things. First, he sees Humanist Wicca as a bridge between two really different worlds, secular humanism and paganism. He thinks it can bring those groups closer together.
That's interesting, because at first glance, those groups seem really different. But maybe they have more in common than we think.
Exactly. Both humanism and Wicca value personal freedom, critical thinking, and respect for nature. And Bryan's approach focuses on those shared values.
Okay, so that's one reason he's optimistic. What's the other one?
I think he also sees that Humanist Wicca is something that people really need right now. A lot of people are moving away from organized religion, but they still want meaning and connection.
So they're looking for a way to be spiritual, but without all the dogma.
Exactly. And Bryan's approach gives them a way to create their own spiritual practice based on ethical living and science.
It's like he's saying you don't have to choose between reason and ritual or between science and spirituality. You can have both.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And that's what makes Humanist Wicca so cool. It embraces both the mind and the heart.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. When I first heard the term Humanist Wicca, I was a little skeptical, not gonna lie. It seemed kind of contradictory. But Bryan's story has really changed my mind.
It's amazing how someone's personal story can change how we see things. But speaking of changing how we see things, remember how Bryan thinks science will eventually explain things like intuition and manifestation?
Oh yeah, that part really got me thinking. How does that fit with the more mystical parts of Wicca? Does he think science will just explain away magic?
Now that's where it gets really interesting. That's a really good question. Does explaining something take away the magic, or does it just, make it even more amazing?
I think it makes it more amazing. Look at how much we learn from science about how the universe works. That just makes me feel even more in awe of everything. So why couldn't that be true for how our minds work?
That's exactly what Bryan's saying. He believes that understanding the science behind something doesn't make it less powerful or meaningful. Actually, it might even help us appreciate how everything is connected even more.
So it's not about saying magic isn't real, but about seeing it in a scientific way.
Exactly. He sees science and spirituality as working together, not against each other.
I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. Instead of thinking a spell works because of a deity, you might see it as your own intention and focus and belief influencing things.
Yeah. And there's actually a lot of research that shows how our thoughts and beliefs can really affect our reality.
So it's not about denying what happens, but looking at it from a different angle.
Right. And that's where critical thinking is so important. Bryan really encourages people to question their assumptions, be open to new ideas, and use reason to guide them.
One thing that really stood out to me about Bryan was how much he talked about personal responsibility. It seems like a really big part of Humanist Wicca.
Definitely. It's about knowing that we have the power to shape our own lives and make choices that match our values.
And that we're responsible for those choices and what happens because of them.
Exactly.
It's pretty empowering when you think about it.
It is. It reminds us that we're not just, along for the ride. We actually create our own reality.
And even when things get tough, we have the strength to deal with them. This has been such an inspiring conversation. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of how to live a life with meaning and purpose.
I'm so glad to hear that. It's been great talking about all of this with you.
Before we finish up, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about how Bryan sees deities as symbols of human nature. You asked a really thought-provoking question. What parts of myself could I personify to understand my subconscious better?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good one, isn't it?
It is. It's like we all have these archetypes inside us, just waiting to be discovered.
And by getting to know those archetypes, we can learn so much about ourselves, our motivations, our strengths, even our weaknesses. It's really helpful for personal growth.
I love that. I think that's a perfect way to wrap things up. To everyone listening, we encourage you to learn more about Humanist Wicca, even if it's just to spark your curiosity about different ways to find meaning.
And maybe think about which parts of yourself you could personify to start your own journey of self-discovery.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it's given you some things to think about and a sense of wonder about what's possible when we question our beliefs and open ourselves to new ideas.